My dear friends, the world often underestimates the power of a single individual. People assume that relationships between nations are shaped only by governments, institutions, and military strategies. Yet, history teaches us that sometimes one man or one woman can tip the balance of power, shift perceptions, and create ripples so strong that entire diplomatic structures tremble. When we talk about US-India relations, most think of trade, defense deals, and political summits. But what if one Indian, with sheer audacity and boldness, disrupted the equilibrium so drastically that the foundations of trust between these two giants started to collapse? This is not just about politics, it's about influence, courage, and the shocking reality that a single person can challenge empires. India and the United States share one of the most complex relationships in modern geopolitics. On one hand, they are strategic allies, bound by defense agreements, technological exchanges, and shared visions of countering rising global powers. On the other hand, there is constant friction over trade, over ideology, over national interests. Both countries walk on a thin line, balancing cooperation with rivalry. In such a fragile atmosphere, one bold act, one unexpected move, or one defiant voice can fracture the illusion of unity. That is what makes this story extraordinary. Not that governments argued, but that one Indian had the audacity to challenge the narrative, revealing cracks no one wanted to admit. This story is not about politics alone. It's about the psychology of power. Nations, like people, often operate on ego, pride, and self-image. The United States sees itself as the torchbearer of democracy, the most powerful nation on earth, while India, rising with economic growth and technological might, seeks recognition as an equal. This creates tension. And into this tension stepped an individual who didn't bow down, who refused to play by the script. One voice against the weight of global powers. One man who exposed the hypocrisy, the exploitation, and the hidden motives behind polished speeches and diplomatic smiles. Sometimes it takes only one act of defiance to reveal the truth everyone was too afraid to confront. Imagine the audacity it takes to stand before the world and speak against the strongest country on the planet. Imagine the courage of an Indian who chose not to remain silent when silence would have been easier, safer, and more profitable. This wasn't a politician carefully weighing words for votes. This wasn't a diplomat speaking in rehearsed lines. This was raw truth, poured out with conviction. And when truth is spoken without fear, it destroys illusions. That destruction is more powerful than any weapon. The United States and India suddenly found themselves in a storm created not by armies, not by sanctions, but by words. Words that cut deeper than steel. The real power of a single individual lies not in their position, but in their refusal to be controlled. Governments may sign treaties, leaders may shake hands, and corporations may exchange billions. But all of that crumbles when someone unmasks the game. The one Indian who shattered the balance of US-India relations didn't come with armies or weapons. He came with clarity, with fearlessness, with the refusal to bend. The result? Leaders grew uncomfortable, narratives collapsed, and the world began to see through the carefully constructed facade. That is how fragile great alliances can be, destroyed not by war, but by truth. Diplomatic relations thrive on perception. They are built on illusions of equality, of mutual respect, of shared goals. Yet beneath the surface lies exploitation, pressure, and manipulation. The United States has always positioned itself as a benefactor, but in reality, every move is about its own advantage. India, rising in power, has long tolerated this dynamic for the sake of growth. But what happens when someone strips away the illusion and exposes the manipulation? The reaction is violent, not in bombs, but in outrage, denials, and ruptured trust. One Indian became the mirror that forced both nations to look at themselves, and they didn't like what they saw. The destruction of illusions is the first step toward freedom. What one Indian did was not sabotage, it was liberation. For decades, India has been expected to play the role of the junior partner, bending when the United States demanded, aligning when Washington insisted. But when this individual stood firm, refusing to bow, it was as if India itself rose with him. The world watched in shock as the balance of power shifted. Suddenly, the US realized that influence has limits. India realized that silence has a cost. and the global stage saw that one person can ignite a movement that neither governments nor armies can suppress. The fearlessness of one voice is more powerful than the agreements of 1,000 leaders. That's why this story is dangerous to those who cling to power. Governments fear individuals who do not play by the rules because they cannot be controlled. They cannot be bribed. They cannot be silenced, and they cannot be intimidated. That is why U.S.-India relations shook to their core. One Indian proved that truth is uncontrollable, and once spoken, it spreads like fire. It questions, it challenges, it exposes. And when truth spreads, no alliance, however strong, can remain the same. Every great disruption in history starts with one rebel, one person who looks at the structure of power and dares to say, "This is not right." Empires have fallen because of such voices. Movements have risen because of them. And here, in the delicate web of U.S.-India diplomacy, one Indian became the disruptor. He wasn't afraid of consequences because he understood something deeper, that nations are not gods. They are built by people, and they can be shaken by people. The United States may hold military might, but what is military power against the courage of an awakened mind? It crumbles. People often believe that individuals are powerless against systems. That is the lie we are fed. We are told that governments are too big, corporations too powerful, and international relations too complex. Yet one Indian proved otherwise. He showed that clarity of vision and refusal to compromise truth is stronger than political machinery. He showed that courage can break illusions that billions of dollars cannot sustain. He showed that when one man decides to stand, even the mightiest nations are forced to sit up and listen. That is the essence of true power, not control, but truth. The destruction of U.S.-India relations was not the collapse of friendship, but the collapse of pretense. Both nations had been pretending. The U.S. pretended it respected India as an equal. India pretended it was satisfied with the scraps of acknowledgement it received. But one Indian ripped away the curtain. He revealed the manipulation, the imbalance, the unspoken exploitation, and once exposed, the relationship could no longer return to its illusion. Trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt on the same lies. It must either transform into something real or it must burn. That is why this moment became historic. For decades, people believe that governments are unshakable. But what they don't understand is that governments fear embarrassment more than war. They fear exposure more than bombs. When one Indian pulled back the mask, he didn't just create political tension. He created humiliation. And humiliation is what destroys alliances. It is what makes powerful nations lash out, withdraw, and reconsider their partnerships. That is why the U.S. reacted with such shock. Not because it lost military ground, but because its image, its dominance, its authority was publicly questioned. And nothing terrifies power more than truth. This is not just a story of nations. It's a lesson for every individual listening. You may think you are small. You may think your voice doesn't matter. You may believe that systems are too powerful to resist, but history proves otherwise. One man can ignite a revolution. One woman can shake an empire. One Indian can disrupt the balance of two global giants. Never underestimate the power of a single voice. Never underestimate your own courage. Because the world is not changed by masses. It is changed by individuals who dare to speak when everyone else stays silent. The courage of one Indian became a wake-up call not only for the United States, but for India itself. It forced leaders, citizens, and thinkers to ask, are we truly independent, or are we still bending to global powers? Are we partners, or are we pawns? These questions spread like wildfire across society, and they could not be silenced. The damage was done, not to the friendship of nations, but to the illusion that kept people blind. And once people wake up, no government, no treaty, no alliance can put them back to sleep. That is the true destruction, awakening minds. This is how history is written, not always by governments, not always by wars, but often by the defiance of one. The U.S.-India relationship was shaken because one Indian refused to bow, refused to stay silent, refused to let illusions rule the world. And in doing so, he taught us all a lesson. The power you think you don't have is exactly the power that can change everything. One voice can destroy illusions. One act can rewrite history. One person can shift the destiny of nations. That is the message hidden in this story. The United States has always believed in the strength of its narrative. It doesn't just use weapons or money to control the world. It uses stories, the idea that it is the ultimate protector of democracy and freedom. But when one Indian refused to buy into that story, when he exposed the cracks in that carefully polished image, it was like shattering glass. Suddenly, the narrative collapsed. Suddenly, the so-called protector was questioned. And when the world questions America's image, it trembles because its real power lies not only in armies, but in perception. One Indian destroyed that perception with courage. India, for decades, has been balancing between pride and compromise. It has sought recognition, it has fought for respect, but often it has bent under pressure from stronger nations. Yet, when this Indian refused to bend, it was as if he carried the pride of 1 billion people with him. His act was not just personal, it was symbolic. It told the United States and the world that India was no longer the silent partner, no longer willing to play second. It announced that one Indian's defiance could represent an entire nation's awakening. That is why his stand shook the foundation of diplomacy itself. The psychology of power is always based on fear. Nations dominate because others are afraid to resist, but when fear vanishes, dominance collapses. One Indian showed no fear, and in that moment the balance shifted. He showed that fearlessness is contagious. Others watched him and thought, if he can stand, so can we. That is the secret of revolutions. Courage spreads faster than fear. And when courage spreads, no system, no alliance, no empire can maintain its grip. That's why this moment wasn't just about diplomacy. It was about awakening the human spirit across borders. Think about this. Governments spend decades building alliances, billions, reinforcing ties, entire armies protecting their influence. And yet, one Indian, standing alone, managed to shake all of it. This is the proof that systems are fragile. They look powerful, but they are weak because they depend on silence. The moment silence is broken, the illusion collapses. The United States wanted India silent, compliant, cooperative. But when silence broke, trust broke. And when trust breaks between nations, rebuilding it is harder than rebuilding after war. That is why his act was irreversible. This is not just about politics, it is about the value of truth. Truth has always been the most dangerous weapon in history. Empires have fallen not because of armies, but because truth could no longer be hidden. One Indian used truth as his weapon. He didn't need soldiers, he didn't need bombs, he didn't need wealth. He only needed conviction. And when conviction meets truth, it becomes unstoppable. That is what the United States could not predict, that one man's voice would echo louder than their billions of dollars and endless propaganda. It was truth, and truth always wins. We often underestimate the ripple effect of a single act. One man stands, and the world begins to question. Questions turn into debates, debates turn into movements, and movements turn into revolutions. That is the chain reaction created here. US-India relations were not destroyed in a single day. They were destroyed. Because the illusion was pierced, and once pierced, it cannot be repaired. People began to demand accountability. Citizens began to see manipulation where once they saw partnership. And when the masses awaken, no government agreement can put them back to sleep. One Indian became the voice of many. He became the embodiment of frustration, of hidden anger, of suppressed pride. For years, Indians have watched as their nation was treated as an ally, but never an equal. They have watched as the United States dictated terms, set conditions, and expected compliance. But when this one man spoke, he unleashed what millions had been feeling but could not express. That is why his words cut so deeply, not because they were new, but because they were the truth people had been waiting to hear. He spoke, and millions felt represented. The destruction of illusions is often painful, but it is necessary. For too long, India had been chasing validation from the United States. For too long, it believed partnership was respect. But respect is not given, it is taken. And one Indian showed that respect begins with refusing to bow. He proved that partnership without equality is slavery, and no nation deserves to live as a servant. His stand was painful, yes, because it shattered ties, but it was also liberating, because it broke chains that had been invisible for decades. Sometimes destruction is not loss, it is freedom. The United States thrives on control. It thrives on being the one who sets the rules. But when one Indian refused to obey, it was as if the rules themselves lost meaning. That's the secret about power. It only works when people agree to play the game. If even one person refuses, the game breaks. And when the game breaks, others start questioning why they are still playing. This was not just an Indian moment, it was a global moment. The world saw that even the most powerful can be defied, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. Courage is the rarest currency in the world, and it is worth more than gold or weapons. One Indian spent that currency without hesitation. He didn't care about consequences, didn't care about rewards, didn't care about what the world would say. That is why his act was unstoppable, because true courage is untouchable. You cannot bribe it, you cannot silence it, you cannot destroy it. Governments can punish bodies, but they cannot touch the spirit of a fearless man. That is why his impact spread far beyond politics. It entered the hearts of people hungry for authenticity. This was not about hatred toward the United States. It was about love, love for truth, love for freedom, love for dignity. That is what makes it powerful. Hatred can be crushed, but love cannot. Hatred creates violence, but love creates revolutions. One Indian stood not because he hated, but because he loved too deeply to remain silent. And that love became fire. Fire that burned illusions, fire that lit up hidden truths, fire that destroyed the comfort of lies. And once fire spreads, there is no going back. That is why the alliance shook to its core. The destruction of US-India relations was not really about diplomacy. It was about identity. India had to decide who it really was, a servant nation bending to power or a rising force standing as equal. And this one man forced the question onto the table. He refused to let India hide behind compromise. He refused to let leaders pretend. He forced the truth into the open. And once identity is questioned, everything else becomes secondary. Trade deals, defense pacts, economic growth, none of it matters if dignity is lost. That is why his act mattered more than all the deals combined. Every generation has its disruptor, someone who comes at the right moment and refuses to play along. Sometimes they are hated, sometimes they are silenced, but always they are remembered. This Indian became the disruptor of our time. He destroyed illusions so strong that even governments feared touching them. And in doing so, he became immortal in the story of nations. People will forget leaders, people will forget treaties, but they will never forget the one who stood alone and spoke truth when silence ruled the world. The lesson is clear. Nations are fragile when built on lies. Alliances are fragile when built on illusions. Power is fragile when built on fear. One Indian proved all of this in a single act of defiance. He didn't just destroy US-India relations as they were. He destroyed the lie that individuals are powerless. He destroyed the myth that truth can be buried. He destroyed the illusion that fear is stronger than courage. And that destruction was not loss, it was rebirth. The rebirth of dignity, of independence, of power that does not beg but demands respect. History will not remember this as a diplomatic failure. It will remember this as a turning point. The day when one Indian reminded the world that a single voice can destroy illusions, shake empires, and rewrite destiny. The United States was shaken, India was awakened, and the world was reminded of the most powerful truth: never underestimate the courage of one, because sometimes one is enough to change everything. The real destruction did not happen in boardrooms or embassies. It happened in the minds of people. Once an illusion is broken, people cannot look at the world the same way again. That is exactly what this one Indian achieved. He forced both nations to confront uncomfortable truths. Americans realized their influence had limits, that they could no longer demand compliance as they once did. Indians realized that silence had cost them their dignity for too long, and once people wake up, governments lose control. This was not just a political crisis, it was a spiritual awakening. The United States has always relied on its ability to intimidate, to charm, and to manipulate. But when one Indian refused to be intimidated, refused to be charmed, and refused to be manipulated, the spell broke. That is the secret of power. It only works when people believe in it. When one person stops believing, the entire illusion begins to collapse. That is why this story matters so much, not because of one act, but because of the chain reaction it created. It proved that even the mightiest powers are vulnerable when faced with fearless truth. India has always been seen as a land of wisdom, a land of spirituality, a land of resilience. But for too long, that image was overshadowed by compromises in the global arena. This one Indian reawakened the original spirit of the nation, the spirit of defiance, of self-respect, of standing tall even in the face of giants. His act wasn't just political, it was cultural. It reminded the world that India is not a nation that bends forever. It bends only until the moment comes to rise. And when it rises, the world feels the quake. That is what happened here. When you look at history, you realize something extraordinary. Nations don't fall because of enemies. They fall because of truths revealed from within. Rome fell not because of outside attacks, but because of rot inside. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of wars, but because its lies could no longer be hidden. In the same way, the United States hold over its alliances weakens every time someone reveals its true motives. One Indian acted as the mirror, and in that mirror, America saw its reflection, and it did not like what it saw. Courage is contagious, but so is weakness. For decades, India's weakness in diplomacy allowed others to dominate. But one man's courage flipped the script. Suddenly, weakness was no longer an option. People began to demand the same courage from leaders, the same boldness from politicians, the same defiance from institutions. His stand became a standard. It set the bar higher than before. And once people taste courage, they never go back to cowardice. That is why the United States feared him. Not because of his power, but because of the courage he spread like wildfire. We often think destruction is negative, but destruction can also be sacred. Sometimes what is false must be destroyed for truth to emerge. Sometimes illusions must burn for reality to shine. That is what this one Indian did. He didn't destroy peace, he destroyed pretense. He didn't destroy friendship, he destroyed manipulation. He didn't destroy nations, he destroyed lies. And in doing so, he created space for something more honest, more real, more powerful. That is the beauty of destruction. It clears the path for rebirth. Every nation hides behind polished speeches and staged photographs. Leaders shake hands for cameras while their eyes calculate hidden advantages. But one Indian refused to play in that theater. He ripped the mask away. And once the mask is gone, the entire performance collapses. That is why this moment shocked the world. It was not supposed to happen. People are supposed to remain silent, obedient, and complicit. But when one refuses, the script burns. And when the script burns, the actors are exposed for what they really are, players in a game of lies. The power of truth is that it spreads without permission. Once spoken, it does not need armies to carry it. It travels from ear to ear, heart to heart, nation to nation. This Indian's words became more than words. They became seeds planted in the soil of consciousness. And seeds, once planted, always grow. They grow in the minds of citizens, in the hearts of leaders, and in the actions of nations. That is why his act could not be contained. Once truth is released, no government in the world has the power to stop it. In the aftermath of his defiance, both nations scrambled. The United States tried to defend its image, tried to spin the narrative, tried to pretend it was still in control. India tried to manage the fallout, tried to balance the outrage, tried to reassure both sides. But none of it mattered. The damage was already done. Once trust is broken, once illusions are shattered, you cannot simply glue them back together. This wasn't a crack in the relationship. It was an earthquake. And earthquakes don't just shake the ground. They reshape the landscape forever. There is a lesson here for every individual. We are told to stay silent, to compromise, to follow the script. We are told that systems are too powerful and that one voice cannot matter. But this one Indian proved that is the greatest lie of all. One voice can matter. One act can matter. One refusal to bow can change the course of history. If nations can be shaken by a single person, imagine what you can do in your own life. Imagine the chains you could break, the illusions you could destroy, the truth you could ignite. The destruction of U.S.-India relations by one Indian is not a tragedy. It is an inspiration. It shows that even the largest structures of power are vulnerable when confronted by fearless truth. It shows that you do not need armies to create impact. It shows that authenticity is more powerful than manipulation. And it shows that every individual has the power to challenge giants. The question is, will you remain silent, or will you find the courage to stand like he did? Because the world does not change through obedience, it changes through defiance. For decades, nations have hidden behind the excuse of national interest. They justify every compromise, every betrayal, every silence with those two words. But what about dignity? What about self-respect? What about truth? One Indian forced that question into the spotlight. He reminded leaders that national interest without dignity is slavery. He reminded people that silence is not peace, it is submission. And once those reminders entered the collective mind, the old excuses lost their power. The narrative of national interest crumbled under the weight of dignity. The United States believed its dominance was unshakable, but dominance is not eternal. It is fragile, built on fear, illusion, and control. One Indian proved that dominance can collapse in an instant when faced with defiance. This was not just a political act, it was symbolic of a larger truth. No power is absolute, no empire is eternal, no alliance is unbreakable, and no manipulation can survive the fire of truth. His act was not only about India and the United States, it was about the destiny of all oppressed voices across the globe. We must understand this was not just destruction, this was a message to the world, a message that silence is no longer acceptable. A message that courage is more powerful than armies. A message that truth, once revealed, can shatter the walls of even the strongest nations. The Indian who stood against two giants did not just create political fallout, he created a new possibility. The possibility of relationships built on equality, of nations built on dignity, of individuals built on courage. And that possibility is worth every bit of destruction it took to create. One act of courage can live for centuries. One refusal to bend can inspire generations. One Indian destroyed the illusion of U.S.-India relations, but in doing so, he built something far greater, the belief that truth cannot be silenced, that dignity cannot be bought, and that power without respect is meaningless. This story will not be forgotten because it is bigger than politics. It is about the eternal battle between illusion and truth, between fear and courage, between silence and defiance. And in that battle, one Indian stood and changed everything. The destruction of U.S.-India relations was not chaos, it was clarity. It forced both nations to see themselves in the mirror of truth. The United States had to face its arrogance, its manipulation, its false mask of equality. India had to face its compromises, its silence, its hunger for validation. And in that moment, both nations stood exposed. That exposure was not comfortable, but it was necessary. Because only when illusions are broken can real progress begin. And it all started because one Indian chose courage over convenience. Powerful nations often believe they control the script of history. They write it with money, with armies, with influence. But history is not written by the powerful. It is written by the fearless. This one Indian carved his place into history not by wealth, not by authority, not by status, but by refusing to bow. And when history looks back, it will not remember the deals or the treaties. It will remember the moment when one man's defiance shook the balance of two global giants and proved that truth is stronger than power. The act of one Indian became a storm. It was not a storm of bullets or bombs, but of ideas. And ideas are indestructible. You can suppress people, but you cannot suppress ideas once they are born. The United States could try to silence him, but it could not silence the millions who resonated with him. India could try to contain the fallout, but it could not contain the fire he had lit. That is the true measure of greatness. When your courage outlives you, when your truth multiplies in the hearts of others, when your storm becomes unstoppable. Think of the courage it takes to stand against the tide, to speak when everyone else whispers, to rise when everyone else kneels. This one Indian carried that courage. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for support. He didn't wait for the right moment. He created the moment. That is why his act became legendary. Because true leaders don't follow opportunities, they create them. He didn't destroy for destruction's sake. He destroyed illusions so truth could live. And that is what separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. The fall of illusions is always louder than the fall of empires, because illusions live in the minds of people, and when they collapse, the whole foundation shifts. One Indian caused that collapse. He proved that respect cannot be demanded by force, that alliances without equality are lies, and that no nation, however powerful, is untouchable when confronted by truth. This was not simply a diplomatic breakdown. It was a psychological revolution, a revolution that began with one Indian and will continue long after him. The greatest strength of one individual is not in their ability to win, but in their refusal to surrender. This Indian refused surrender in every form. He refused to surrender his dignity, his voice, his truth, and that refusal became contagious. Others looked at him and realized they too could refuse. They too could rise. They too could demand respect. That is why his act destroyed more than relations. It destroyed fear. And when fear dies, the world changes forever. The United States wanted obedience. India wanted validation. But what this Indian wanted was something greater: authenticity. He wanted a relationship built not on manipulation, but on respect. And when that was denied, he chose truth over pretense. That choice may have burned bridges, but it also built a path forward. Because a relationship based on lies is not a relationship at all. It is slavery. He chose freedom. And in choosing freedom, he redefined what true partnership should mean between nations. Every great revolution begins with discomfort. People resist it at first. They fear it. They deny it. But in time, they realize that discomfort was the beginning of growth. That is what happened here. US-India relations were destroyed, yes, but only because they were never truly equal. They had to collapse so something real could take their place. And though the destruction was loud, it carried within it the seeds of rebirth. That is why One Indian's act was not an end. It was the beginning of something greater. The world loves to celebrate leaders who make deals, but it often fears the ones who break illusions. Yet it is the illusion breakers who change the world. This Indian was not celebrated at first. He was attacked, criticized, and labeled as dangerous. But time always reveals the truth. And when the dust settled, people realized he had not destroyed peace. He had destroyed lies. And destroying lies is the highest service one can give to humanity. Because truth, no matter how painful, is always more valuable than a comfortable illusion. You may wonder, how can one person hold so much power? The answer is simple. Because truth requires only one voice. Lies require armies to defend them. Illusions require endless effort to maintain. But truth stands alone. That is why one Indian's voice outweighed the might of two nations' lies. Because truth does not need support. It needs courage. And once spoken with courage, it becomes immortal. That is the lesson that will echo through history long after these nations forget their treaties and deals. The destruction of US-India relations is not a story of failure. It is a story of independence. It is the story of one Indian who proved that dignity is worth more than diplomacy, that courage is worth more than compromise, and that truth is worth more than treaties. This story will inspire not only Indians, not only Americans, but people across the world who live under the illusion of power. It will remind them that illusions can be broken, that voices can rise, and that freedom begins with one act of defiance. We live in a world that tells us to stay small, to obey, to fit in. But this story reminds us that the world does not change when you obey. It changes when you refuse. One Indian refused and the world shifted. He became the proof that you do not need an army to make an impact. You need courage. You need conviction. You need the fire inside you that refuses to be silenced. That is how nations are shaken. And that is how destinies are rewritten. By one person who dares to stand when everyone else kneels. The United States may recover from this. India may rebuild its alliances. But the truth spoken by one Indian will never die. It will live in the memory of nations. It will echo in the hearts of citizens. It will inspire future leaders who refuse to compromise dignity for deals. That is the true destruction, when lies die, but truth lives forever. And in that sense, this Indian did not destroy relations. He destroyed illusions. And what is built after illusions fall will always be stronger, purer, and real. This is the ultimate reminder. You are never too small to create change. Nations may look untouchable, but they are fragile when faced with truth. Systems may look permanent, but they collapse when individuals refuse to comply. Power may look infinite, but it is nothing compared to one fearless voice. If one Indian could shake the world, what excuse do you have to stay silent? What illusion are you allowing to rule your life? His story is not just about nations, it is about you. Your courage can destroy illusions too. And so, history will remember this moment not as the collapse of relations, but as the rise of courage. One Indian stood and nations trembled. One Indian spoke and lies crumbled. One Indian refused and the world awakened. This is the power of one. And this is the lesson you must carry. Never underestimate your voice. Never underestimate your courage. And never underestimate your truth. Because sometimes all it takes is one to destroy illusions and change the destiny of millions.